Most people think sugar hurts you in obvious ways. You gain a little weight. Your teeth get worse. Maybe your energy crashes in the afternoon. Maybe one day, years later, someone says the word diabetes. But that is not how the real damage works. The real damage is quieter than that. It begins in places you cannot see. Inside your blood, inside your liver, inside your kidneys, inside the lining of your blood vessels, inside the cells that are trying every second to keep you alive. And the reason sugar is so dangerous is not because it destroys the body all at once. It is because it teaches the body to live in a damaged state for so long that the damage starts to feel normal. That is how people get trapped, not by collapse, by adaptation. Little changes, tiny shifts, small metabolic compromises repeated so often that the body slowly drifts away from health without making enough noise to be noticed. That is why sugar quietly destroys you from the inside out. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, because the body is so good at compensating that most people do not realize what is happening until the compensation begins to fail. And by then, the damage is no longer theoretical. It is biological. It is measurable. It is written into organs, hormones, arteries, and tissues that have been under stress for years. To understand how this happens, you have to stop thinking about sugar as a harmless pleasure and start seeing it as a biochemical signal. Because every time sugar enters the body, especially in concentrated processed forms, it sends instructions. It tells the pancreas to release insulin. It tells the liver to begin processing an unusual energy load. It tells the brain that a fast reward has arrived. It tells fat cells that storage conditions are favorable. It tells blood vessels they may soon be exposed to a chemical environment they were never designed to tolerate every day. And if that signal is repeated enough times, the body begins remodeling itself around it. That is the real story. The destruction is not random. It is organized. It follows pathways. And it spreads in a pattern. It begins with absorption. When you eat or drink sugar, especially in liquid form, it moves into the bloodstream quickly. That is one reason sugary drinks are so metabolically aggressive. There is almost no friction, no fiber to slow things down, no real digestive resistance, just a rapid flood of glucose and fructose entering the system. According to data from the American Heart Association, the average American adult consumes approximately 77 grams of added sugar per day. That is more than 60 pounds per year. The recommended daily limit is no more than 36 grams for men and 25 grams for women. Most people are consuming 2 to 3 times that amount without even realizing it. And the body has to respond immediately. Glucose raises blood sugar. That part most people already know. So the pancreas releases insulin to move that glucose out of the blood and into cells. Again, insulin itself is not the problem. Insulin is essential. Without it, blood sugar would stay elevated and tissues would be damaged even faster. The problem is what happens when the body is forced to use that system too often. At first, it works beautifully. The pancreas rises to the occasion. Cells respond. Blood sugar comes back down. Everything appears normal. But normal on the outside does not always mean healthy on the inside. Because if sugar keeps coming in again and again, the body starts adapting to the repeated insulin signal. Cells begin responding less efficiently. The same amount of insulin no longer does the same job. So the pancreas compensates by releasing more. That is the beginning of insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is one of the most dangerous, quiet transitions in all of human biology. A study published in the journal Diabetes Care found that insulin resistance can be detected an average of 13 years before a person receives an official type 2 diabetes diagnosis. Over a decade of hidden metabolic dysfunction already running in the background, while standard blood sugar tests still appeared relatively normal, because now the body can still look functional while the internal environment is already shifting into disease. Higher insulin becomes the new baseline. Fat storage becomes easier. Fat burning becomes harder. Hunger regulation becomes more distorted. Inflammatory signaling becomes more persistent. Blood sugar may still look not that bad for a while, but the hormonal climate has already changed. And once that climate changes, the damage begins spreading into multiple organs at the same time. Now the liver enters the story. This is where sugar becomes even more dangerous, because not all sugar is handled the same way. Glucose can be used by many tissues throughout the body. Fructose is different. Fructose is handled largely by the liver. That means when you consume table sugar, high-fructose corn syrup, sweet drinks, pastries, desserts, and most ultra-processed sugary foods, the liver becomes one of the main places where the damage is processed. And the liver does not just passively sit there, it has to do something with what it receives. If energy intake is high and the body does not immediately need that incoming sugar, the liver begins converting part of that load into fat. This process is called de novo lipogenesis, new fat creation. That is the mechanism many people never hear about. You do not need to eat large amounts of fat to accumulate fat in the liver. Excess sugar can be turned into fat internally. In 2009, a research team led by Dr. Kimber Stanhope at the University of California, Davis, published a study in the Journal of Clinical Investigation that compared subjects drinking fructose-sweetened beverages versus glucose-sweetened beverages over a 1-0-week period. The fructose group showed a significant increase in de novo lipogenesis, higher visceral fat accumulation, greater insulin resistance, and elevated triglyceride levels. The glucose group did not show the same degree of metabolic damage. It was one of the first studies to clearly demonstrate that fructose places a disproportionate metabolic burden on the liver compared to other sugars. And when this happens often enough, fat begins building up inside the liver itself. That is how non-alcoholic fatty liver disease develops. Quietly, without pain, without obvious warning, without the dramatic signs people expect. Today, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease affects an estimated 25 to 30% of the adult population worldwide, according to research published in the Journal of Hepatology. In the United States, it has become the most common chronic liver condition, and the majority of people who have it do not know, because in its early stages, there are usually no symptoms at all. The liver can become more inflamed, more insulin-resistant, and more metabolically dysfunctional, while the person carrying it still believes they are doing relatively fine. That is what makes this so dangerous. A damaged liver does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it simply performs a little worse each year. A little more fat storage, a little more inflammation, a little less glucose control, a little more triglyceride production. And because the liver sits at the center of metabolic control, once it becomes dysfunctional, the rest of the body begins paying the price. Blood sugar regulation worsens. Lipid levels become more abnormal. Energy distribution changes. The body starts becoming better at storing fuel than using it. Now the pancreas has to work harder, because rising insulin resistance means the same meal demands a bigger hormonal response. So the pancreas keeps compensating. More insulin, more pressure, more cellular work. And here is one of the cruelest parts of this entire system. The pancreas is trying to protect you. It is not failing because it is weak. It is failing because it has been overused. The UK Prospective Diabetes Study, one of the largest and longest clinical trials on type 2 diabetes, found that by the time a person is clinically diagnosed, they may have already lost approximately 50% of their beta cell function. Half of the pancreas's insulin-producing capacity already gone before the diagnosis was even made. For years, maybe decades, it may hold blood sugar in a near normal range by forcing out more and more insulin. That is why people can have serious metabolic dysfunction long before they are officially diabetic. The lab result comes later. The strain comes first. The diagnosis is not usually the start of the story. It is the moment the body can no longer hide the story. And while this is happening, sugar is doing something else that is even more silent. It is beginning to damage the bloodstream itself. When glucose remains elevated too often, it starts binding to proteins and structures it was never meant to bind to. This process is called glycation. It sounds technical, but the idea is simple. Sugar starts sticking to things. And when that happens, it creates harmful compounds known as advanced glycation end products. These compounds increase oxidative stress, worsen inflammation, damage tissue structure, and accelerate aging. A landmark review published in the journal Circulation by the American Heart Association confirmed that advanced glycation end products contribute directly to endothelial dysfunction, arterial stiffness, and increased cardiovascular risk. The researchers noted that AGE accumulation is not exclusive to diabetics. It occurs in anyone exposed to repeated high glucose levels over time. Now imagine that happening inside blood vessels. Your blood vessels are lined with a thin, delicate layer called the endothelium. This lining helps regulate blood flow, clotting, vascular tone, and overall circulation. But repeated glucose spikes, insulin resistance, glycation, and oxidative stress injure that lining over time. At first, you do not feel that. You do not feel endothelial dysfunction. You do not feel the first stages of vascular stiffness. You do not feel the microscopic inflammation building in the walls of arteries. But your body feels it. Your tissues feel it. And slowly, circulation becomes less efficient. Blood pressure regulation becomes less elegant. Plaque formation becomes more likely. The cardiovascular system starts shifting away from resilience and toward vulnerability. This is why sugar is not just about diabetes. It is about the entire vascular highway that keeps every organ alive. The eyes depend on blood vessels. The brain depends on blood vessels. The heart depends on blood vessels. The kidneys depend on blood vessels. If the vascular system is under chemical attack often enough, the damage spreads everywhere. And that brings us to the kidneys. This is one of the most underappreciated consequences of sugar. People tend to blame kidneys on salt or dehydration or age, but metabolic dysfunction can be brutal to kidney tissue. The kidneys filter the blood. That is their job. But when blood sugar stays elevated, insulin resistance rises, vascular stress increases, and inflammatory signals become chronic, the kidneys are forced into an abnormal state called hyperfiltration. That means the filtration units are pushed to work under higher pressure than normal. At first, this may look like function, but it is actually strain. Imagine an engine running too hot for too long. It still works, until it starts wearing itself down. That is what hyperfiltration does. A study published in the journal Kidney International found that even in individuals without diabetes, higher sugar and fructose intake was associated with markers of early kidney stress, including elevated serum uric acid and microalbuminuria, which is the leaking of small amounts of protein into the urine. The kidneys were already showing signs of damage before any formal kidney disease diagnosis had been made. And fructose adds another layer. Fructose metabolism can raise uric acid and contribute to oxidative stress, which further disrupts vascular function and metabolic stability inside the kidney environment. Over time, the filtering barrier begins taking damage. Proteins that should remain in the blood can begin leaking out. Scar tissue can form. Healthy filters can be lost one by one. And the terrifying part is that you do not feel this happening in real time. A nephron does not die with a dramatic warning. It dies quietly. which means the body can lose function slowly enough that the person living inside it never notices until the reserve capacity is already reduced. That is how sugar destroys from the inside out. Not by one catastrophic event. By forcing one silent compromise after another, then there is body fat. Not just the fat you can see in the mirror, the fat around the organs. The fat that changes the chemistry of the body. When insulin stays elevated, storage becomes the default setting, and some of that energy begins accumulating as visceral fat. Visceral fat is not passive. It is metabolically active tissue. It releases inflammatory compounds. It worsens insulin resistance. It disturbs hormone signaling. It increases risk across the board. Research published in the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology described visceral fat as functioning like an endocrine organ, actively secreting inflammatory cytokines including interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. These compounds directly worsen insulin resistance and contribute to a systemic inflammatory state that raises the risk of cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, and certain cancers. That means the body is no longer just carrying extra energy. It is carrying an inflammatory organ around the organs. This is why abdominal fat in a high-sugar, high-insulin environment is not merely a cosmetic issue. It is a biological warning sign. It means the metabolic climate is changing. The body is moving toward a state where inflammation, resistance, and dysfunction feed each other. And because visceral fat worsens insulin resistance, it makes the original problem even stronger. Now the body needs more insulin. More storage happens. More metabolic stress is created. The cycle closes on itself. And while all of this is happening, the brain is being trained in a completely different way. Sugar does not just affect organs. It affects behavior. It activates dopamine-based reward pathways. That makes sugar feel emotionally useful. It becomes relief. It becomes comfort. It becomes stimulation. It becomes a shortcut when energy is low or stress is high. And the more often the brain uses sugar as a fast reward, the more it begins expecting that reward. A 2012 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by researchers at Yale University used functional MRI brain imaging to compare the effects of glucose versus fructose consumption. They found that fructose significantly reduced activity in the hypothalamus and cortical brain regions responsible for satiety and impulse control, while glucose did not produce the same suppression. In simple terms, fructose made the brain less aware that the body had received enough energy, which may explain why sugary foods and drinks are so easy to overconsume. Cravings become stronger, impulse control becomes weaker, mood becomes more tied to food. The brain starts associating discomfort with the need for sweetness. This is where the damage becomes psychological as well as metabolic, because now the person is not just dealing with a blood sugar problem. They are dealing with a reward loop, a loop where sugar provides temporary pleasure, then creates instability. And that instability makes the person want more sugar again. Rapid spikes, rapid crashes, short-term relief, long-term stress. That is not a character flaw. That is neurobiology responding to repeated reinforcement. And because the brain is so energy dependent, unstable glucose regulation can also show up as fogginess, irritability, low concentration, fatigue, and emotional volatility. People often blame themselves for that. They think they are lazy, undisciplined, burned out. But sometimes what they are feeling is the consequence of living in a body that is chemically unstable. A body swinging between reward and crash. And the inside-out damage does not stop there. Sugar also changes the way the body ages. The same glycation process that injures blood vessels also affects collagen and elastin, the structural proteins that help keep skin firm and elastic. When sugar binds to those proteins, they become stiffer, weaker, and more fragile. That means more sagging, more dullness, less elasticity, faster visible aging. So when people say sugar makes them look older, there is real chemistry behind that statement. A 2011 study published in the journal Age measured the perceived ages of over 600 participants and cross-referenced them with blood glucose levels. They found that individuals with higher blood glucose were consistently judged to look older than their actual age. For every 1 millimole per liter increase in blood sugar, perceived age increased by approximately 5 months. The researchers concluded that blood glucose is a significant and independent factor in how old a person appears. And that visible aging matters because it reveals something deeper. If sugar is accelerating damage in tissues you can see, imagine what it is doing in tissues you cannot see. Imagine what it is doing in arterial walls, in kidney filters, in liver cells, in pancreatic beta cells, in nerve tissue, in the microscopic structures your life depends on every day. And then there is inflammation, one of the most misunderstood words in modern health. People think of inflammation as something obvious: a swollen ankle, a sore joint, a visible injury. But metabolic inflammation is different. It can be low-grade, chronic, and almost invisible. Sugar contributes to that environment by driving insulin resistance, fat accumulation, oxidative stress, glycation, liver dysfunction, and reward instability all at once. The body becomes a little more reactive, a little more stressed, a little less resilient. And when that low-grade inflammation persists for years, it helps set the stage for disease far beyond blood sugar alone. That is why sugar is linked not only to obesity and diabetes, but also to cardiovascular disease, fatty liver, kidney decline, cognitive dysfunction, and accelerated aging. Not because sugar is magic, because the pathways it touches are everywhere. It touches fuel handling, hormones, vascular integrity, cellular stress, organ workload, structural proteins, brain reward. And when one substance interferes with that many systems at once, the consequences stop being isolated. They become systemic. That is what inside out really means. It means the damage begins internally, in silent biological layers, and only later becomes visible on the outside as symptoms, diagnoses, fatigue, belly fat, high blood pressure, bad labs, poor skin, unstable energy, or chronic disease. The outside is late. The inside comes first. And that is what makes this so dangerous in the modern world. Because modern diets do not expose people to sugar occasionally. They expose people to it constantly. Breakfast is sweet. Drinks are sweet. Snacks are sweet. Sauces are sweet. Health foods are sweet. Even foods that do not taste especially sweet may still carry sugar in concentrated processed forms. The body never gets much relief. Never enough quiet. Never enough time in a truly stable metabolic state. It is always adjusting, always compensating, always cleaning up, always buffering the next wave. And the body can do that for a long time. That is why people underestimate the danger. The body is heroic. It absorbs insult after insult and still keeps going. But the cost accumulates. And eventually, what used to be compensation becomes dysfunction. What used to be silent becomes visible. What used to be manageable becomes disease. The good news is that the process can move in the other direction too. When you reduce added sugar, especially liquid sugar and highly processed sugar-heavy foods, the body often begins shifting back towards stability. Insulin demand falls. Blood sugar spikes become less violent. The liver gets relief from constant fructose overload. De novo, lipogenesis slows down. A clinical study published in the journal Gastroenterology found that when participants reduced their added sugar intake, particularly fructose, liver fat decreased by an average of 22% in just 9 days. Even without any changes to total calorie intake or body weight, the liver began recovering almost immediately once the fructose burden was reduced. Fat storage pressure begins easing, reward pathways gradually calm down, cravings become less intense, inflammatory burden drops, the kidneys face less metabolic stress, the blood vessels experience fewer glycation events. The body does not become perfect overnight, but it changes direction. And direction matters. Because if repeated sugar exposure taught the body to survive in a damaged state, repeated metabolic relief can begin teaching it to recover. Not instantly, not magically, but measurably. That is the deeper truth most people miss. Sugar is not just dangerous because of what it does in one moment. It is dangerous because of what it trains the body to become over time. A little more insulin resistant, a little more inflamed, a little more fatty, a little more stressed, a little more aged, a little less stable, a little less resilient, until one day, the inside can no longer hide what has been happening all along. So if you want the simplest possible summary, here it is. Sugar quietly destroys you from the inside out because it turns hidden biological stress into a daily routine. It overworks the pancreas. It burdens the liver. It strains the kidneys. It damages blood vessels. It accelerates glycation. It feeds visceral fat. It destabilizes the brain's reward system. It increases inflammation. And it does all of this gradually enough that most people never realize how much has changed until the damage becomes visible. That is why this is not just a food issue. It is not just a weight issue. It is not just a diabetes issue. It is a full body systems issue, a chemistry issue, a signaling issue, a long-term survival issue. And once you understand that, you stop asking whether sugar is merely bad. You start asking what kind of internal life repeated sugar exposure is building inside the body. Because that is the real question. Not what sugar tastes like. Not what sugar feels like in the moment. But what sugar is teaching your organs to endure every single day. And once you see that clearly, the damage is no longer invisible. And if you want to see just how deep that damage can go from a single source most people consider healthy, the next video on this channel is going to shock you. Because a glass of orange juice, something millions of people drink every morning believing it is good for them, has the same effect on your liver as a can of beer. Not similar. The same metabolic pathway. The same fat creation process. The same organ under the same stress. That video is next.